Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Conover. I'm one of the therapists at Nexus Youth and Family Services, and I'm going to be bringing you guys the wellness workshop for this month. We are going to look at the topic of telehealth services. So before we kind of dive into what telehealth services are, I'm going to show you guys the next slide and just kind of talk just for a second about mental health in general. If there's anything that the pandemic has showed us in the last 2 years and counting, it's that health matters a lot. Our physical health is obviously important because our bodies need to function, and the brain is a part of our body. So our mental health, taking care of our mind, is just as important as the rest of our body. Our mental health plays a crucial role in our overall life satisfaction, and it really helps dictate how we interact with others. So it doesn't just affect us, it affects everyone in our system. So taking care of our minds sometimes requires help, and that is okay. There are times where we just can't do it all on our own. And thankfully, there are professionals, whether that be therapists or social workers or psychiatrists or whoever, who are really able to help. And with the advent of telehealth, which is what we're going to be talking about today, there are now a ton of different ways to be able to seek out and receive some much needed mental health support. So now we can really get to the root of the video and just see what even is telehealth. What do I mean when I talk about that? Generally speaking, telehealth is when a healthcare professional provides services to a patient, to a client, without being in person. So it's essentially medical care or mental health, any kind of health care that is administered over the phone or video. And so it doesn't have to just be a medical doctor who you're meeting with over the phone. Telehealth can also apply to the field of mental health. So it can be used to meet with a therapist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. So medical doctors are able to use this for routine checkups or to speak about pretty much any kind of non-urgent health concerns or any questions that you have. And it can also be used for other services within the healthcare field, dermatology, ophthalmology, physical therapy, all sorts of that stuff. The COVID-19 pandemic and telehealth are pretty closely tied together because prior to the pandemic, telehealth was utilized some of the time. It was not necessarily a new thing. It was being used here and there. But once COVID hit, it became essential. When everything was shut down and nobody was doing anything in person, kind of around mid-March of 2020, that's when telehealth really vaulted into the forefront. And it's helpful, right? But it's not comprehensive. So the switch to telehealth, at least for that short stint where everything was almost exclusively telehealth, unless it was urgent medical care, it was helpful in limiting the spread to some degree. But it's really not ideal for comprehensive treatment, right? Because you can't have a procedure like a surgery. You can't receive oxygen or any kind of physical necessity. It's just not going to be possible over video or over the phone. So it definitely became infinitely more prominent because of COVID, but it's definitely not the end-all be-all. So for mental health, the switch to telehealth early on in the pandemic provided millions of people with continued mental health treatment. So whereas with normal medical care, it was not necessarily possible to switch to telehealth entirely. There were certain therapists that were able to make the change just at the snap of a finger and say, okay, we're not going to meet in person anymore. We're just going to have sessions over video. and it didn't disrupt their care at all. Because for some versions of therapy, there really isn't a necessity to be in person. So they were really able to make that change pretty seamlessly for some. For others, it was more difficult. It's better, but it's not necessarily perfect. Mental health treatment is generally easier to maintain a high quality of care versus medical treatment because of the in-person treatment remaining necessary for a lot of different conditions and procedures. So who can use it? The short answer is anyone. Um, Basically anyone of any age, well, nearly, is able to utilize telehealth in some way. Children as young as preschool age can use it to speak with teachers or counselors. They just might need some help typing. I know early on in the pandemic, I was able to provide some telehealth sessions to some clients because we weren't allowed to see clients in person for a certain amount of time. And even with the younger kids who we were counseling via telehealth, there were ways to be able to help keep them engaged. It was not as easy as it normally would be in person. Had to get a little bit of creative, but there were ways. Teenagers are definitely able to do that. Average teenager nowadays is pretty knowledgeable about being able to operate a computer and using common programs like Zoom or one of the other telehealth platforms that we use. And teenagers, by and large, were fairly self-sufficient during the stage of the pandemic where all learning was distance learning, right? So they would be able to utilize mental health for telehealth as well. Some adults faced a learning curve when COVID began, and a lot of people were working from home. The work from home boom really started at that point, and so most adults, kind of trying to figure out Zoom, but they were able to do it. Um, and elders, technology has advanced rapidly, even just over the last 10 years. So imagine over the last 50 or 60, elders have had to continuously try to learn and a lot of the time feel very behind. So they had to always learn new systems, and then once they learned that one, moved on to the next one. So the telehealth, the work from home necessity really hit elders pretty hard, just generally speaking. Some of the common uses of telehealth for the overall field of mental health, there's quite a few. The most common one would be weekly individual therapy sessions. I know there's a lot of different private practice therapists as well as community mental health centers and different mental health agencies that now offer telehealth therapy regularly. It's just a part of what they offer now. And prior to the pandemic, that really wasn't all that common. So you can see how COVID really pushed that forward much faster. But yeah, there's quite a few private therapists or licensed clinical social workers who also provide therapy who offer telehealth. And I know of some that even still haven't made the transition back to in-person. For some of them, they're just continuing to do telehealth permanently. They just found that it works really well for them. Meetings with social workers or even just social service case managers. They're able to utilize telehealth as a way to be able to kind of meet with larger groups of people. So they're able to not just meet with, parents, but they're also able to meet with the foster parents or therapists or teachers or whoever they need. And it can be a lot easier for them than having to try to get a ton of people with a ton of different schedules all in one room. Parenting classes, same kind of thing. Being able to work around people's schedules, not have to worry about drive times or, oh, where am I going to find a babysitter, that kind of thing. Telehealth parenting classes provided can be really a lifesaver for a lot of parents, to be able to learn more about how to be a great parent and parenting strategies and behavioral management strategies for their kids and all that good stuff. Group therapy sessions also can absolutely be performed via telehealth. Group therapy is just when a therapist is meeting with a group of people instead of just one individual person to work on, whatever issue they want to work on. So a lot of the time they'll kind of focus on one issue for the entire group, whether that's grief or addiction or anxiety or whatever it is. They're totally able to do that on telehealth. And then also there's even crisis de-escalation. Normally this would probably be on the phone as opposed to FaceTime, because if someone's in crisis, they're not necessarily going to be able to think super clearly about, okay, what kind of steps am I going to do to be able to, tackle this problem. And so there's all sorts of social workers, therapists, case managers who are on call for whatever crisis there may be, whether it's for, foster youth or for anyone else who just needs additional support. There are times where obviously there are certain crises where only police should respond, or only a hospital should respond, but there are certain lower level crises that are able to be handled by trained professionals over the phone, and then they're able to talk them down, make sure whatever the problem is resolved, and then next day or whenever they're able to go out and check on them in person, make sure everything's good. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the common uses of telehealth in the field of mental health, but it's definitely not exhaustive. There's still even more that it can be used for. So just some more details about what telehealth looks like in terms of mental health treatment. Very specifically for weekly therapy sessions for adults, a lot of the time it'll just be a Zoom call or even a phone call, and just talking about whatever's on their mind, and whatever modality the therapist wants to use. A lot of the time it might just be talking, or sometimes it might be answering questions, or some sort of guided activity or exercise, all of which can be done without being in person. So this means that the therapist obviously has to be pretty familiar with the program's technical features. And a lot of the time this is even more important for therapists that have telehealth sessions with children. Because with children, even though it's not in person, that just means you have to kind of overcompensate in terms of how engaging you're able to be. Because without being able to give them a physical toy or play a physical game with them, you need to kind of have a game plan for how to circumnavigate that. So I know Zoom in particular has like a whiteboard feature where you're able to give the child or the teenager control, and they're able to draw on it. So things like that, or being able to share your screen and have a game, like an online game set up that's still therapeutic. These are some of the really specific things that therapists are able to do in order to make telehealth more engaging. And group therapy would work in a similar fashion. If it's adults, people are probably going to take turns talking about whatever they're going through, and the therapist might have a little bit of education that they're able to provide on whatever issue it is they're talking about. And group therapy for children over Zoom would be more like a group activity. So maybe they take turns drawing on the whiteboard feature, or maybe the therapist has some sort of like toy on their end that is able to engage the child on their end without having to hold it in person. And like I said in the previous slide, parenting classes would typically have the professional, whoever the licensed or mental health professional, whoever that would be, they'd be sharing a lecture, probably have some sort of visual presentation like a PowerPoint shared on the screen, so that the people are able to see and follow along. And like I said before, crisis situation generally would be over the phone. Sometimes physical intervention has to be required if the crisis escalates to severe. But a lot of the time, you might be able to talk them down over the phone. Now I have some numbers for you to just kind of put things into perspective. So March 2019, full year before the pandemic started, roughly 1 million people in the US were using telehealth services. So a pretty solid amount of people, but still 1 out of every 300 in America, not necessarily that much. Um, but in March 2020, so soon as the pandemic hit, 1.629 million people were using telehealth services. So we saw a 50% increase in people using telehealth services within a span of a year, really within a span of a couple of weeks, all because of the pandemic. That's how much the pandemic accelerated the usage of telehealth. Probably some of you had never used telehealth prior to the pandemic, and now some of you, if not a lot of you, probably have. That's how much it sped up that process. It boosted the numbers significantly. And really, it's here to stay. So prior to the pandemic, about 11% of patients who had health care utilized telehealth, and now 46% do. So the number jumped up astronomically, and ever since, even though restrictions are way down now, they're still using telehealth a lot. So really, it is the new norm. So some of the common telehealth platforms that are HIPAA compliant, meaning that they're able to protect confidentiality, protect the privacy of the user based on the type of software. It needs a certain level of security. I found 6 that I've used several of these, and the other ones that I haven't used have come pretty highly recommended, highly regarded. So these are mainly telehealth platforms used primarily for mental health purposes. There's a whole bunch of others that are used for medical telehealth purposes. But for this discussion, we're really focusing on mental health telehealth treatment. So the first one is called DoxyMe, and it is just a video user interface meant for medical professionals. Doctors can use it, therapists can use it. Works very similar to Zoom. The second one is called Simple Practice. Simple Practice is software that private practice therapists use. It's pretty comprehensive. They can use it for billing, scheduling, and then once the pandemic started, they added the video conferencing feature. Theranest works pretty much the same way. Zoom for healthcare is different than general Zoom. You've probably used general Zoom before for working from home or whatever you've used it for. But Zoom for healthcare is specifically for healthcare professionals because, again, like I said, they need the HIPAA compliance, so they need the extra level of security, making sure no one will be able to hack into your meeting, make sure no one will be able to see your files, that kind of thing, make sure the privacy is really, really good. And then there are 2 other ones that are similar to Theranest and Simple Practice called VC and TheraLink. Of course, we got to talk about the pros and cons of telehealth because there certainly are limitations, but also benefits. Some of the limitations of telehealth, for one, because it's still relatively new, insurance companies may not cover it. Insurance companies a lot of the time will cover a certain amount of a normal therapy session, but insurance companies aren't always quick to change policies, so they might not yet, depending on your provider, cover your telehealth therapy sessions. Technology is not always reliable. Sometimes, Wi-Fi cuts out, and sometimes Zoom crashes. You never really can predict what kind of technology snafu is going to come up on any given day. Confidentiality is more difficult to ensure, even if a platform is totally HIPAA compliant and the firewall is super strong. You never know who um, might be on the other side of the screen. So, for a therapist who it looks like they're talking to one person across the screen, maybe their kid is listening in, or maybe their spouse is within earshot, or maybe their partner has a friend over who overhears something. You're really never 100% sure who else is on the other side of the screen as the therapist, and so confidentiality is definitely harder to ensure. It can be harder to respond in a crisis. So if you were in a therapy session with someone and suddenly they start talking about suicide, it's a little bit harder to respond in that situation than just being with them in person. Another thing is that you can't see body language. So someone might be really nervously tapping their fingers, but you can't see it because it might not be, in your plane of view. And then, of course, there's interruptions and distractions. The baby might start crying, the door might knock, the dog might start barking. There's no shortage of interruptions and distractions that all of us, I'm sure, have experienced while engaging in some form of video conferencing during this work from home period. So those are just some of the limitations. But of course, there are also benefits. There's comfort. You're able to, as a therapist, I'm able to meet with a client where they are most comfortable. So, for people who might feel more anxious about going into a new environment, telehealth can be pretty helpful. It's also cost efficient. Everybody saves money on gas, and as a therapist, for someone who's in private practice, if you're entirely telehealth, you would have no overhead cost having to rent a building or rent the space where you have your therapy sessions. It's pretty convenient as long as the patient or the client stays in the same state. You can essentially meet from anywhere. Um, you know, Between states, it gets a little bit trickier because most therapists are only licensed in one state. Sometimes you can get licensed in multiple. Sometimes doctors can, operate from multiple, but that's really something that would have to be addressed by the professional. They can be just as effective as in-person mental health treatment. If it's just talk therapy, then a lot of the time you don't really see a lack of effectiveness there. It's obviously very accessible. You can meet during times and places when when patients would not normally be able to. And it's also sometimes more affordable. Sometimes it's less expensive than in-person treatment, depending on the provider. For those of you who have never engaged with some sort of telehealth service before, this is how you start. First, you can check with your healthcare provider to see if they cover the cost. Obviously, because sometimes healthcare can be pretty draining on the bank account, it's always wise to check with your healthcare first. After that, you can research in-state mental health professionals to see who offers telehealth services. If you go on psychologytoday.com, you'd be able to use a specific filter in order to figure that out. Then, of course, you have to make sure you have reliable technology, because otherwise it's going to be cutting in and out. If your Wi-Fi is not good, it might really hinder the experience. And then after that, you sign up and start. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I am Nathan Conover, MFT trainee over at Nexus Youth and Family Services in Jackson, California. Our number is listed right there on the screen in case you want to get a hold of us, in case you want to gain access to our services. We offer counseling, youth advocacy, supervised visitation, parenting classes, all sorts of stuff. So if you want to see more content like this video, like and subscribe, and hopefully you'll see you soon.